Good day, everyone. I'm Carolyn Donovan from Olympus. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar entitled, Understand the U.S. Regulation of the Fashion Accessory Industry, How to Manage Risk and Reduce Testing Costs with XRF Technology. This webinar is a joint venture between Olympus NDT, the Fashion Jewelry and Accessories Trade Association, with participation from the law firm Keller & Heckman, LLP. We have with us as presenters Joshine Chen and Megan Ropolo from Olympus, Brett Cleveland of FJATA, and Sheila Millar of Keller & Heckman. This webinar is budgeted for approximately 60 minutes. The main presentation should last approximately 45 minutes, leaving 15 minutes for questions. Topics to be covered are an overview of FJATA and its work in the regulatory area, a recap of the regulations that impact children's products and costume jewelry, green chemistry compliance issues, and an explanation of XRF technology and how it can be used as a screening tool to help you comply with regulations. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A panel in the lower right portion of your screen during the course of this presentation. Do not type your questions into the chat panel, as we will not monitor chat for attendee Q&A. And now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the presentation over to Brent Cleveland.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. The Fashion Jewelry and Accessories Trade Association, representing over 225 brands, is the industry voice dealing with legislative issues. We provide our members with up-to-date email notices on breaking news, a free consulting service, trade discounts, and a monthly newsletter. We become part of your compliance department. We are actively engaged in supporting good bills, fighting bad bills, and we developed the first science-based peer-reviewed jewelry safety standard that is supported by the Consumer Product Safety Commission. More on that later. But now I will turn it over to Joshine, who will discuss compliance issues.
Thank you, Brent. Thank you all for coming to the webinar. A little bit about Olympus 8 and 9 division. We were bought by Olympus in 2010, and we are the leading companies in portable XRF and XRD technology, and over 10,000 units have been sold. With offices around the world, we have local support centers to support you and your analysts wherever they are being utilized. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me after the webinar. Now, back to the main content. Today, first, let's talk about the California Proposition 65, which is known as Prop 65, and the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, known as CPMA. Many of you might already have knowledge about Prop 65. So what is the main message here? Prop 65 was first published in 1986 in order to protect California's drinking water sources from chemical contamination. It also allows California consumers to make decisions based on the information they have. In addition, the law enables residents and workers to take appropriate actions to protect themselves from being exposed to harmful chemicals. The main message here is that an individual has the right to be informed if they are exposed to harmful chemicals. The law itself does not ban or restrict the use of any given chemical. Currently, there are 850 plus chemicals on the list, and the list is reviewed regularly. Among these chemicals, the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, OEHA, has safe harbor levels for around 250 chemicals. These chemicals' safe harbor level are acceptable levels of chemical exposure that do not require Prop 65 warning. The safe harbor levels are in the form of human daily intake levels instead of total content levels or migration levels. So to assess the risk, a complex toxicology analysis might be required and would be very costly. So you might ask, how about the rest of 600 plus chemicals that are without suggested limits? For those substances, you either refer to other regulations that provide guidance for calculating a level, or based on your expertise, you can develop your own safe harbor level. So how do they enforce the law? What makes Prop 65 so special is the way it is enforced. It is not by OEHR, the leading agency for the regulations. It is enforced exclusively by lawsuits brought by the California Attorney General, by any district attorney, certain city attorneys, or even private parties that acting in the public interest. So some people think this is like a bounty hunter game. The AG or DA can file enforcement action without notice, and a private person may sue if no prosecutor takes the cases within 60 days of the notice of violation. For the people who enforce the law, it's relatively easy to prove the exposure to certain chemical, but it might be tough for you as a defendant to prove the exposure has no significant risk because of two reasons. First, not all chemicals have a safe harbor level, and even if they do, the limits are extremely low. In addition, the law specifically provided a portion of civil penalties that collected in the actions to the group that brings the lawsuit. This provided a financial incentive to file claims against California businesses who have failed to provide appropriate warnings. Let's review the enforcement and total settlement since year 2000. During the past 11 years, over $150 million in settlements have been reached. Each year, there are nearly 200 cases settled, with an average settlement around $60,000. This does not include legal fees or other costs imposed on the business, nor does it include the costs of cases that actually went to trial. And you might notice, although the settlement per case is decreasing, there were more cases being brought up in the recent years. In 2011, there were almost 350 notices, almost a new case per day.
As mentioned, part of the fee will go to the groups who bring the lawsuit. However, the biggest portion ends up as attorney fees and costs. This is the data from 2011. As shown, there was almost 73% end up as the attorney fees and costs. When you look at the top 3 attorney winners in 2011, each of them pocketed millions of dollars in fees and costs. By offering a cash reward with little or no risk of loss, individuals or organizations have every incentive to file litigation against a business in California. That is why people call this a bounty hunter game. So what is 60 days running notice? This is a legal document that is served as a private party to a manufacturer, alleging violation of Prop 65 warning requirements. As shown on the list, we can include a few high-risk industries and high-risk substances here. Fashion jewelry, accessory, and children's product industries are constantly on the top of the list. Lead, phthalates, and cadmiums are among the top concerns. I would suggest the business owners in those industries should definitely have a detailed evaluation of their risk. So how could we comply with Prop 65? There were a few strategies that we could follow. First, we could consider a complete testing, which means test every component of the product for all chemicals on the Prop 65 list. Of course, this approach would be very costly. And sometimes there are technical challenges as well. There might be no available analytical testing method for determining the amount of chemical in certain material. So even you are willing to pay for the cost, you still need to overcome this technical obstacle. Another way, some people will choose to so-called target testing, which means targeting certain high-risk components of a product. This strategy will require you to understand your product very well, and you have to assume that your suppliers won't change the formula of the product. People sometimes might look at previous settlements as standard. So this strategy should be applied if you have a very similar formula for a very similar product that settled before. Although even following this standard, there is no guarantee that you're in compliance with Prop 65 requirements as well. So putting a warning label is another strategy. So what does it mean by attaching a warning label? there are two implications. The first is the business has evaluated the product and has concluded that it contains one or more listed chemicals that exceed the no significant risk level or the no observable effect level. The another implication is the business has chosen to provide a warning simply based on its knowledge about the presence of a listed chemical without attempting to evaluate exposure. Some people believe this strategy could prevent them from trouble, which is not necessary because of two reasons. First, if you also sell your goods outside California, think about that. If you don't have absolute control of your supply chain, how the consumer in New York, in Boston, in Chicago react to your product that with a warning label? The warning label might have a negative impact on your business. Another issue is it won't prevent you from violating other laws. For instance, if a consumer product contains more than 100 parts per million of lead in the substrate, it violates the CPMA, the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, even with the warning label. So simply putting a warning label without carefully evaluating your product is very risky. And practically, some retailers might not accept items that with warning labels on it. So always remember, the best way to protect your business is to know the product and your supplier and having a supply chain risk management program in place, such as reasonable testing program that we will discuss later in the presentation. Next, we will touch on CPMA. The law was first introduced in 2008. Although it covers all consumer products, it is focused mostly toward children's products, which are any product intended to be used by a child 12 years of age or younger. This group is particularly vulnerable to lead. That's why we pay attention to them. It regulates lead at two different levels. For bulk material, the regulation limit is 100 ppm, while for surface painting, the regulation is 90 ppm. Last year, the regulation has dropped to the current levels that stated on the previous slide, and during the same year, there were two important rules that came out. One is the conditions and requirements for relying on component testing rule. The other is the testing and labeling pertaining to product certification rule. Within the second rule, the third-party testing rule is the center of the discussion. For the component testing rule, it mentioned the responsible parties may issue a children's product certification, CPC, or General Conformity Certification, GCC, based on component reports or certifications. So now, the finished goods could be certified partly or entirely based on the test reports for the individual components. For example, if you manufacture children's clothes with zippers and your zipper supplier has certified them for lead, you could use this report to support your certification of the finished goods. But when you apply this rule, you should always remember to exercise your due care, which means you must review and ensure the appropriateness of the documentation. Also, you need to keep a record of compliance and make sure it is traceable. In addition, when there is a material change, such as change in design, manufacturing process, or your main suppliers, you need to recertify the product. So what product should be sent to the third party? For its third-party testing, it is only applied to children's products. It covers toys, children's clothing, and a few other product categories. And U.S. importers and domestic manufacturers are the two parties who are responsible for generate the GCC or CPC under the rule. As mentioned, children's products must undergo third-party testing, while non-children's products can be certified via a reasonable testing program. To ensure continuing product compliance, it is required that the children's product to be sent to the lab periodically in addition to the initial testing. The minimum required testing interval will vary based on what other periodic testing procedures are in place. If there is no risk management program in place, the maximum testing interval is up to 1 year. But it is 2 years if you have a production testing plan or RTP in place, and a maximum every 3 years if an in-house accredited lab. Under the rule, there are a number of factors listed in the regulation which have an impact on the decision. For example, if there's a material change, you might need to retest part of the entire product immediately. So why we need to have a RTP or TPP? Because a reasonable testing program can be used to certify for non-children's products under CPMA. At the same time, RTP helps you control risk and save costs for children's product testing in 2 ways. First, based on the rule, you may send out fewer samples if you create finished products that are uniform in composition and quality to provide a high degree of assurance of compliance. RTP can help you to achieve that goal, so you could send fewer samples to the lab. Secondly, as discussed, you can send the samples to the lab with less frequency with RTP. The program can save you both time and money, and most importantly, control the risk. The cost-saving effect here is subject to a list of factors under the rules. As you could notice, lately there's an increasing enforcement of CPMA. The slides show 2 news articles from the CPSC website. From January to June this year, CPSC port investigators screened more than 6,600 imported products at ports of entry and stopped more than 1 million units of violated or dangerous products. And children's products contain high levels of lead still top the list. Next, Brent, I'm going to turn over to Brent. He's going to talk about ASTM method.
Well, thank you, Jiaxin. It's important to note that Prop 65 attacks on jewelry products have never been challenged in court. The exposure levels listed in the safe harbor list have little to do with total content ppms or the micrograms that may migrate, and there's no reliable conversion or relationship between those factors. It is referred to as legal extortion because it's less expensive to settle than to fight, and settlement is the road most followed. In fact, FJATA was born out of the original Prop 65 jewelry settlement known as the Burlington Coat Settlement. We were actively involved in the development of the CPMA, Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act, and took on the cadmium fight when it was reported in January 2010 that toxic chemicals were in children's jewelry. We heard the public's concerns and began work on the issue. We commissioned the test, analyzed the data, chaired the ASTM committee, and worked with CPSC, and 2 years later we completed the ASTM Children's Jewelry Safety Standard. Now, the Children's Jewelry Safety Standard addresses all known hazards and risks relating to children's jewelry and accessories, not just the chemical du jour. It supports age grading, defining children's products as designed and intentionally marketed to children 12 and under. It limits body-piercing materials to surgical steel, titanium, niobium, 14-karat gold or higher, platinum, or plastic. It conforms to CPMA lead levels and offers a screening level of 300 ppm total cadmium with a migration option that must yield less than 200 micrograms, also stating that only metals and plastics need to be tested. The surface coating requirement conforms to the toy standard, as industry that participated in our committee had little problem complying with those migration levels, measuring antimony, arsenic, barium, cadmium, chromium, mercury, and selenium. It requires nickel migration testing for nickel components similar to the EU requirement, and also deals with batteries and magnets, to me of real concern. The CDC reports that from 1997 to 2010, there were 40,400 incidents reported to the emergency rooms relating to battery incidents or injuries, of which 14 were fatal. The standard also screens for dangerous liquids and even strangulation prevention. The standard can be purchased from the ASTM website. So, why is this important? The standard addresses all known hazards and risks. It creates an accepted science-based peer-reviewed standard that will be used as the foundation for subsequent regulation, supporting a risk-assessed platform, and we needed to provide states with consensus numbers to use in future legislation. Once the standard was completed, it gained CPSC report and was the basis for state law in Rhode Island, and created the foundation to seek Connecticut and Maryland's repeal or amendment to their existing cadmium law, followed by our Washington state effort to repeal the lowest in the country, a 40 ppm total cadmium content limit. The resolution of Prop 65 is always in our sights. Now we can provide Prop 65 insurance to our members as an added level of protection. It will cover $150,000 in coverage of payments and legal fees once a 60-day notice is received. We have now finished the adult standard, and it's in its final stage of balloting. It should be ready for publishing by the end of the year, at which time we'll submit it to the CPSC, enlisting their support. Now, it limits the adult standard, limits led to match California law. It supports age grading, migration surface coating limits, body-piercing materials, but it raises the cadmium screening level to 1.5% or 15,000 ppm with the same 200 microgram migration option, which is significant because we found through our testing that cadmium really doesn't migrate that well from the metals that it might exist in. Of significant value will be for retailers to conform to the widely accepted adult standard instead of using random numbers in their internal standards. This, of course, will promote harmonization. So what does it do? Does it preempt state law? No. Does it preempt Prop 65? No. Well, does it even conform to the California Department of Toxic Substance Control? No. Does it conform to CPMA? Well, in lead, yes, but the standard goes much further. What it does is establish a science-based set of rules that can be used as the basis for enlisting state support and for support for national harmonized standards. This is significant. At any rate, now I have the great pleasure to present Sheila Millar, FJATA Corporate Counsel and partner of Keller & Heckman, who will speak about the new challenges with green chemistry compliance issues. Sheila?
Thanks, Brent, and thanks, Xiaojing. You gave a good overview of Prop 65 and CPSIA and the role of standards in the mix. I'm going to change the topic a little bit and talk about some upcoming challenges for the jewelry and accessories industry posed by green chemistry initiatives and the broader universe of chemical bans and deselection. So some quick background. Green chemistry is the notion of reducing or eliminating the presence of hazardous chemicals in consumer products. And at some level, the ultimate goal is to use this kind of right-to-know effort to gain chemical deselection. And they do that by a focus on consumer products. Now, the core of these green chemistry initiatives, however, is based on a somewhat flawed concept, and that is a movement away from sound science, which is grounded in the notion that toxicity plus exposure equals a risk of hazardous exposure when you're dealing with chemicals, with a new theory that presence equals risk. That, in turn, has been part of the proliferation of free-of claims that we see so visibly in the marketplace. So when we think about our public policy objectives in fighting against bad chemical bans, we have to acknowledge that the marketplace and the advertising with this focus on free-of does create a tension with our larger goals of sound science. But generally, there are mostly state laws, but kind of the granddaddy of what we call green chemistry is EPA's Design for the Environment program. At the state level, most, but not all, state legislation, somewhat like CPMA, focuses on children's products, and there are varying exclusions for things like packaging, food packaging, etc. Specifically, a lot of the laws that apply to children's products would include both packaging for children's products and children's clothing, children's jewelry, children's shoes, etc. So again, this is a right-to-know type of approach. Now, there are a number of states that have green chemistry initiatives, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to talk briefly about three: California, Washington, and Maine. So for Washington, and some of you may have already experienced a requirement of reporting in Washington State or Maine, probably not Maine because they only have 3 chemicals listed, but these states get a little bit ignored because their laws apply only to children's products. California is still working on their regulations, but when California is done, it will apply to all consumer products. So it's very important to be studying the landscape of the green chemistry laws to identify how this might affect you. The common elements are that the state laws establish a process to identify and prioritize chemicals, but also in specific products. So somewhat similar to Prop 65, and in the case of California, there is discussion that the regulation would automatically recognize all of the Prop 65 chemicals as part of their priority chemical list, but then there will be a focus on specific products. Where that will net out when California is done, we're not sure. But at the end of the day, the states require reporting on the presence of listed chemicals. So the covered chemicals in a covered product have to be reported. And generally, for the state laws, you must report any intentionally added chemical in any amount. There are exclusions for unintentional contaminants. The scope of the exclusions do differ somewhat. In Washington State, for example, there is an exclusion for unintentional contaminants present at 100 parts per million or less, but that number can go up if you have a program to control unintentional contaminants. So this notion of internal control, process control, becomes very relevant to the green chemistry reports as well as to CPSIA, for example. Another important feature of green chemistry is alternatives assessment. So in some states, like in Maine, for example, you not only have to report the presence of a listed chemical, and the good news is that Maine currently only has 3 covered chemicals, probably none of which are significant for the fashion industry, but the submission of an AA is mandatory. In Washington, where reports are also required now for the largest companies making initially child care articles, AAs are voluntary, but they do have fairly well-developed guidance that's available at their website. The California legislation also requires submission of an AA, and the law establishes some very specific factors that have to be accommodated or accounted for in your AA. At a recent workshop that one of my scientists in our San Francisco office attended, the DTSC staff said there is no available AA tool currently today that will fully comply with California law. That's a big issue because as it is, the available tools can be very complex and very expensive to deal with. But the rules generally are that you have to have an AA done by someone who's capable, certified to do it, and if the state doesn't like your alternatives assessment, they can commission another assessment and charge you for it. So what we've seen in Maine, for example, with reports for bisphenol A, for example, is that those reports on the presence of the listed substance in certain products were the subject of FOIA requests. Those FOIA requests turned into demands to the state to require AAs. The state did so, didn't like the results, and they're in a process of commissioning AAs. So this can be a very costly situation. And of course, as these public reports get out, one worry we have is that it could trigger additional product liability lawsuits related to fear of chemicals, for example, and that this focus on the presence of certain chemicals may force a loss of focus on overall safety and cost implications. So in some of the state laws, the states do have specific options in response to reports of the presence of chemicals. They can require warnings. They can require certain requirements for disposal, and even move to a sales ban if a safer, functionally equivalent, technologically feasible and economically feasible alternative exists. And what we've seen in the state of Maine, for example, and this, Maine's law covers bisphenol A in certain infant feeding products, for example, is the activist groups have been advocating for a complete ban, basically arguing that I could use glass which isn't so practical a way to move food through the supply chain because of breakage, for example. So when we put all these pieces together, Prop 65, CPSIA, green chemistry, this focus on chemicals and products, we do see greater potential for bans and deselection. A lot of drivers. It's not just the law and regulations, but we have a lot of media focus. We have mommy bloggers. We have nonprofit groups. We have academics. We have, and we have a lack of understanding of why chemicals are in products and what their presence means. So at a practical reality level for CPSIA, for Prop 65, for green chemistry, there are a lot of reasons why it is essential for companies to really make that effort to understand what chemicals are in their products, why they're used. It's also important, as FJATA has been doing, to advocate for science-based decision-making and to educate and be educated on why chemicals are used and what the benefits are and how to put that risk and exposure in context. Some of those chemicals, of course, can be identified through XRF, and Megan is going to take us through how XRF technology can be used as part of your testing regime.
Thank you, Sheila. I'd like to start with a brief explanation of how X-ray fluorescence works. So XRF is an elemental analysis technique. X-rays are produced by the X-ray tube in the instrument, and then they pass through the analyzer window to excite the atoms that are in your sample. When those atoms settle back down to their ground state, they release secondary X-rays, which are collected by the instrument's detector. And each element in a sample gives off X-rays of a characteristic energy. So the software algorithms can translate this spectrum of collected X-rays into easy-to-read concentration values for each element present in your sample. As we sometimes say in our office, all you really need to remember about the technique is that X-rays go into your sample, X-rays come out, we do complicated math, and then you get results. All of the elements that are outlined on the slide here in a red box can be detected using XRF. We go from magnesium up to plutonium. And these elements can be detected at levels that are as low as parts per million all the way up to 100%. So XRF is not a standalone method for determining compliance with regulations, but it does form a useful part of a reasonable testing program, or an RTP. A reasonable testing program has the following parts. First, a product specification that describes the consumer product and lists the safety rules and standards with which it must comply. Certification tests, which are performed on the consumer product to demonstrate that the product is capable of passing the test prescribed by the safety standards. And XRF can be used as one type of certification test. A production testing plan, which describes the tests that must be performed and at what intervals to provide reasonable assurance that the products meet all applicable safety rules. A remedial action plan, which is employed when the results from any compliance test yield unacceptable or failing results. And then lastly, documentation of your RTP and how it was implemented. So XRF is a very useful certification test because it allows for the quick screening of many samples. And the more samples you test, the more certain you can be that your whole batch is compliant. If you only send a small number of products away for lab testing, you can have uncertainty that the rest of your inventory is compliant. You could send more items to the lab, but then you pay more lab fees and you also lose inventory to destructive testing methods. By owning an XRF analyzer, many samples can be tested quickly and non-destructively with a few samples sent to the lab for further confirmation. This saves you money on lab fees as well as destroyed merchandise while still effectively managing risk. The XRF results can also be used as part of your RTP documentation process. By keeping your hard or soft copies of all testing results, you build a history of your company's compliance with regulations. The reasonable testing program is useful for product manufacturing cycle management. Screening raw materials, work in process, allows you to pinpoint the sources of restricted elements if they're being introduced in the manufacturing process. For example, if you find no lead in a raw material or in your work in process, but then you find lead in a finished good, you might conclude that one of the machines in your manufacturing process could be introducing lead into your product. A reasonable testing program is also a very effective supply chain management tool. By testing materials coming in from your suppliers, you can identify failing materials before they end up in your finished goods. Also, if you test the products from different suppliers, you can quickly differentiate good suppliers from unqualified suppliers. One benefit of XRF as a screening tool is the quick test times. Results can be obtained in seconds or minutes instead of days or weeks when you have to wait for lab results. XRF can also report the concentrations of 20 or more elements simultaneously as opposed to testing each element individually. This allows you to test many more samples than would otherwise be possible with lab testing alone. The XRF method is non-destructive, so you can test many samples without the high cost of destroying inventory. You can test in situ, meaning that you test right in your warehouse or office or storefront without having to ship or transport your samples. The operation of the instrument does not require a scientific background. The instrument can be preset with your desired elemental action levels so that the user will see a simple pass or fail result on the screen. And XRF helps to balance the cost of risk management with risk. By doing more screening with a lower cost per test, you lower your overall risk of noncompliance. The testing can also be documented and used for general certificate of conformity in cases where third-party testing is not mandated, for example, in non-children's consumer products. Some things to consider when using XRF. XRF is a surface technique, meaning if the sample is coated or painted, elements at the surface will be reported as disproportionately high compared to the bulk material. If an item has a thick coating of paint, it is beneficial to test the painted side as well as the unpainted side in order to fully detect the elements in the bulk material. Also, XRF detects elements such as lead or cadmium, but it cannot detect compounds such as phthalates. You should be familiar with the limit of detection, or LOD, for the elements of concern in your sample type. The LODs can vary depending on the density and the elemental makeup of your material. It's important to understand your sample and the regulations. You need to test what you expect to be the riskiest areas. For example, a painted area that might have lead paint. Also, it's important to understand the regulation requirements for your product. An analyzer can be set up with any action limit, but it has to be the correct limit for the regions where your product is sold. You should also know the capability and limitations of the XRF hardware. X-ray tube voltages can vary between 40 and 50 kiloelectron volts, and the different voltages can cause different detection limits for some heavier elements. The type of detector can also make a difference. A silicon drift detector is more sensitive than a pin diode detector, although in many cases a pin diode will give you adequate performance at a lower cost. So knowing your sample well will help you determine what type of tube and detector are the most appropriate for your needs. And finally, it's very important to operate the instrument in a safe way. Although the doses of radiation from an XRF analyzer are very low, any user should receive training on how to operate the instrument so that they can protect themselves from exposure. Some factors that can affect your XRF results. The first is sample homogeneity. Many consumer products are not homogeneous, meaning that they're not the same throughout. So when testing a non-homogeneous product, it will likely only be possible to get a qualitative result rather than a quantitative one. That is to say that the results will be able to show the presence or absence of an element, but will not be able to definitively report their numerical concentrations. Also, infinite thickness is defined as a sample that is thick enough so that the X-rays will not pass completely through. And for polymers, the samples you look at should be at least 5 millimeters thick, about 1 millimeter for alloys, and 15 millimeters for liquids. Sample preparation, in addition to making sure a sample is clean of obvious dust, it could sometimes be necessary to remove paint from a sample to effectively test the substrate material. The sample size and shape. It is possible to test a very small sample, but the best results come from samples that fully cover the testing window, about 10 millimeters. So you want to always try to maximize the amount of sample covering the window for any given test. The calibration. Your XRF performance depends on the quality of the factory calibration, which in turn depends on the accuracy of the calibration standards that are used. So if a material is atypical, we suggest working with the manufacturer to recalibrate the instrument based on the particular material to give the best results. There are also matrix effects. XRF is a matrix-sensitive technique, which means that the interferences between specific elements have to be taken into account during the analysis. As an example, if you have a brass with high bismuth content, the LODs for lead will be higher than in a brass that contains no bismuth. So some frequently asked questions. The first is, why is homogeneity important? As I mentioned before, a non-homogeneous sample will often provide only qualitative results due to the different chemistries of different areas of the sample. It is a good idea to always test this type of sample in several areas to get a better sense of the overall chemistry of the product. Next, how do we interpret an inconclusive result? So in addition to pass and fail, you can also receive an inconclusive result. This result can mean that the element in question is present in a substantial amount that may be very close to the action limit. So for this reason, it's good practice to do additional testing on an inconclusive product. And one way to decrease the number of inconclusive results that you get is to increase your testing time on those types of samples. And then the last question is the one that we get by far the most. And the question is, why are my XRF results different from the lab results? And there are lots of reasons why this can happen. Some of them are sample homogeneity, which I've already mentioned above. The digestion of a sample in the lab. This can yield different overall results. For example, if you had a circuit board, let's say, with lead in the solder, but no lead in the plastic substrate, XRF would likely give you a failing result if you test the solder area. However, in a lab result, if you digest the entire sample, you average out the lead content over the whole volume of the sample, and you could possibly get a passing result from the lab. So it's always important to keep this in your mind when looking at your lab results. Also, the testing method used by the lab can vary. There are a lot of methods out there. Depending on which method they follow, you could get two different results from two different labs, and you can also get results differing between your XRF and lab results. Next, human error. Of course, this is inherent in all types of testing. Doing a large number of tests via XRF screening is one way of minimizing the effect of human error. Also, you need to compare the same sample, or we sometimes say comparing apples to apples. For example, if you have two pendants, let's say, that visually are identical, you send one off to a lab while keeping the other one to test by XRF, you may find that you get different results due to some differences in the two items, like if the paint that you used on each one was from a different supplier. Although the items look identical, the best technique is to always test the exact same sample. So in this case, testing one pendant by XRF and then sending that exact same one off to a lab. And then lastly, the XRF calibration can be an issue if the calibration used in the factory is not a good match for the types of material being tested in the field. So you can work with a manufacturer to tweak the calibration to fit the types of samples that you're testing. In this chart, you can see some XRF performance results for some of the elements that are of interest to makers of consumer products. The concentrations are listed in parts per million, and as you can see, some very low levels are achievable for elements like lead and mercury, depending on the type of sample being tested and the energy of the X-ray beam being used. So the samples used in collecting this data are tested for a relatively long test time using homogeneous, interference-free standards. So when you set up your own reasonable testing program, you'll be able to determine what the LODs will be for the elements in your own real-world samples. So now I'm going to hand it back to Jaishin for our Q&A section.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Sheila and Brent, for all the detailed discussion. So now we are open for Q&A. So Brent, I have one question for you here. Do you have to conform to the agreed upon limits for lead and cadmium in POP 65 consent agreements?
Well, that's a very good question. Technically, if you sign a consent agreement, you're entering into a relationship between you and the other party, which means that it would only affect you. Where it gets complicated, though, is that if you're not a signatory and you don't comply with it and you sell that signatory and you have an indemnification with that signatory client that may be your retail customer, you would end up getting into a mess with them as well, because of course it would be non-compliant. So it's not an easy question to answer, but there are also those who believe that if you adhere to those low levels that have been stated in a consent agreement, then you would be left alone by the bounty hunters that are out there enforcing these actions. Where that gets complicated is they keep reducing the number, and also this never ends up going to court and getting tested. It always ends at the 60-day notice in a settlement so far. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Brent. And Sheila, I understand there's a very important recent POP 65 decision just released. So would you like to share those information with us?
Sure. There was a very important decision recently by a California Court of Appeals, Federal Court of Appeals. Keller and Heckman has represented the Styrene Information and Research Council for many years, so we had some direct involvement in the case because we've worked with them on the scientific end of things. Styrene is a suspect carcinogen under IARC, which is an international group that identifies potential hazards to chemical substances. It's an IARC group 2B, which is a possible carcinogen. So there was a challenge to the listing by OEHA, which attempted to automatically list both styrene and vinyl acetate on the Prop 65 list based on their IARC Group 2B listing. And we prevailed in the court because the Group 2B substances are listed by IARC based on only limited human and animal evidence, not the sufficient evidence that's the equivalent to California's known carcinogen criteria. The state is appealing that, so we can stay tuned for some additional action, but it does indicate that there is opportunity to address on a science-based level implications of these statutes, and the ultimate test may be where you have certain chemicals that are listed based on a certain route of exposure, like inhalation exposure, and the actual route of exposure in a particular consumer product would not involve inhalation. There may actually be some additional interesting avenues for challenging Prop 65 actions for those who are inclined to really take on the science aspect of it.
Thanks. There were two questions that actually are related. The first question is how many chemicals that are on the Prop 65 list can be detected using XRF technology? And is it any other technology that can screen for chemicals that XRF cannot detect? Before I turn things over to Megan, I just want to emphasize that for Prop 65, the safe harbor level actually is set as a daily intake level instead of the total content like in ppm. So basically, the best way to detect to be compliant with the Prop 65 is have a toxicology analyst, which is very expensive. But some people will refer to some previous settlements. As you can see from the website from Prop 65, for instance, there is a discussion about lead in jewelry. So actually, there's an answer there that you could kind of refer, if you have a similar product or similar formula, you could refer to the previous settlement within this industry. So another thing is, as you can see, XRF can only detect elements, not compounds, but Megan will give us more information. Megan, would you like to comment?
Sure. So I think that one thing that's important to stress is that XRF cannot test for organic compounds such as phthalates. It cannot test for any elements below magnesium on the periodic table. And I saw another question that asked, why is that the case? Why can't we test below magnesium? The answer quickly is that the X-rays that are emitted are not energetic enough to reach the detector. It's basically physics. Until we can change physics, we can't test anything lower than magnesium. So if you have organic compounds that you have to test for, such as phthalates, mass spectrometry is probably a common technique that you might want to look into. Also, another wet chemistry technique that is often used is called ICP. So those are some techniques that you can look into when you need to do third-party testing.
Thank you, Megan. So, Brent, there's a question for you. It's about how do we define children's jewelry versus adult jewelry?
Well, children's jewelry is defined as a product that's designed and intentionally marketed to children 12 and under. And if our standard goes into further detail by saying that you have to look at it in its totality. What a lot of people have done is to put on their earring cards, their point-of-sale displays, things like saying for children over 6 or not for children 12 and under, if it's exclusively an adult product. But that's how it's denoted. Sheila, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think you have to look at the totality of the circumstances. So, for example, if you have a puppy pin that's marketed and it's very cute, maybe mirrors a current cartoon character, and it's sold in the children's department and it's labeled not for children 12 and under, regardless of the labeling, it's going to be viewed as a children's product. If you sell, you know, a poodle pin with crystal eyes at the jewelry counter of a major department store, it's going to be indicative that it's a general use product, not for children. So the short answer is that the children's jewelry standard includes some detailed appendices that outline some of the factors, because for the fashion industry, we can't live by a rule that says if I have a character in jewelry, it's universally a kid's jewelry. You have to look at the totality of the factors.
Okay, thanks. So there's another question asked, can the XRF gun detect the safe harbor levels of nickel? So again, as you can see, the safe harbor level is, we mentioned, it's in the daily intake level is not in ppm. So basically what the result from XRF is the total content of the product. So a lot of time people, if you want to do a complete testing, probably you could get an idea, but definitely not from XRF technology. How this technology can help you is help you to screen if you have some other, like, because if there's no safe harbor level for certain elements, you need to either refer to the other regulations or you need to establish your own safe harbor levels. So, for instance, if you need to refer to the other regulation levels which regulate the elements in total content, that is the best way that XRF can help. But of course, for instance, they also regulate lead, cadmium in the safe harbor list. But when you look at, like, for instance, for California, they regulate the total content of cadmium around 300 ppm. So if you could use the XRF gun to scan the product and make sure it's within 300 ppm, at least it helps you to prevent you to violating one of the California law there. So that's pretty much my answer. So Megan, do you have any comment about the XRF gun?
Well, it really depends on the type of sample. In an alloy sample, we can get down pretty low, but again, the regulations are really not about the actual level of nickel or any other element. They're about the accessibility of the nickel. So the best way is to do some testing on a particular product to get a better sense of the LODs for elements in that particular matrix, since the technique is matrix sensitive.
So Brent, there's another question about the ASTM standard. What is the ASTM standard and its status? If you have any, I think it refers to the children's jewelry and the adult jewelry.
Yes, well, the children's jewelry standard is the ASTM F2923-11, and that is available for purchase on the ASTM website. And the adult standard is in its final stages of balloting and won't be available for purchase until probably January of next year. But that standard is currently available. Let's see. Yeah, I thought there was another question, but I think that's it.
You can also, do you have the similar answers to that?
I don't understand. So go ahead.
Another question is putting California Prop 65 warning label on adult jewelry. Are we doing okay per law? So before you jump in, I just want to comment that just like presented in the webinar, if you only have the warning label without knowing what exactly is in your product, it won't prevent you from violating the other regulations, such as what we just mentioned. So if you contain cadmium more than 300 ppm, you already violate the law in California. If you have products contain 100 ppm lead in the substrate, you violate the CPMA. So if you put on the label, probably will help you with Prop 65, but as you can see, there are more than Prop 65, more regulations about all these toxic elements. So I hope I answered this question. So Brent, do you have any input?
Yes, I see the other question that I was going to answer. The question is there a push to get all states to have the same regulations? And absolutely, there is a push, and that is very much what FJATA is all about. We have the Rhode Island law that's based on the standard that has passed. We're halfway through New York, and that we've passed the Senate. We're working with Connecticut, Maryland, and once we get Washington on board. But our whole game plan is to have a national standard so that either voluntary or mandated, that will all conform and be harmonious.
I see. Megan, there's a question for you. That is there any direct or indirect correction between XRF results and wet chemicals results?
Well, there can be. It's possible to produce some kind of correlation between the two results, but it works best when you're dealing with homogeneous materials where the sample type matches the calibration on the XRF, then the correlation usually is good. If the materials don't match the exact calibration on the XRF, then you can get a bias in your results between the XRF and the wet chemistry, but you can actually correct that bias using an adjustment to your calibration. So For example, if you see good correlation with wet chemistry results, but you have about a bias of maybe 20% high in your XRF results, you can actually adjust your XRF calibration to get your XRF results to match your testing results from the lab. And then if you continue to test similar samples to the one that you tested at the lab, that calibration will hold for the future tests.
So on behalf of Olympus, I'd like to thank Brent, Sheila, Jasheen, and Megan for their participation in today's event. Thanks very much to all of the attendees for joining us. We hope the material presented today was informative and useful. So that's going to do it for today. And again, thanks to everyone for participating. We'll see you the next time.